She thought her wealth could buy her anything, including the right to humiliate others. But when she called the black waitress filthy, her own husband stood up and said 4 words that would change everything. "That's my sister." The Saturday evening crowd at La Belle Epoque was exactly what you'd expect from the city's most exclusive restaurant. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across white tablecloths. Servers moved between tables like dancers in perfectly pressed uniforms. The soft murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle clink of expensive silverware against bone china. This wasn't a place where you just walked and reservations were booked months in. Advance, the clientele included federal judges, Fortune 500 CEOs, senators, and their wives, old money families who've been dining here since the restaurant opened 30 years ago. Tonight was no different. Before we dive into the story of justice and family bonds, hit that subscribe button. If you believe karma always finds its way to those who deserve it, and drop a comment telling us about a time you witnessed someone get exactly what they had coming. Now, let's see how one word changed everything. Behind the mahogany hostess stand stood Jasmine Williams, 26 years old nursing student at George Washington University. Working her second job of the day, she'd already pulled an 8-hour shift at the pediatric clinic where she volunteered. But rent doesn't pay itself and medical school won't fund itself. Jasmine had been working at La Belle Epoque for almost 2 years, long enough to recognize the regulars, long enough to know which tables tipped well and which ones treated the staff like they were invisible tonight. She was covering the west dining room's 6 tables of the restaurant's most demanding customers. She moved with practiced efficiency, balancing 3 plates on her left arm while carrying a wine bottle in her right hand. Her uniform was spotless, her smile genuine, even after a 14-hour day that started before dawn. The exhaustion sat in her bones, but she pushed through it the way she pushed through everything else that threatened to derail her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse. Someday she'd help heal children who looked like her, who came from neighborhoods like hers, who needed someone to believe in them the way Dr. Martinez at the clinic believed in her. At table 12, near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's financial district, sat a couple who commanded attention not because of their warmth, but because of the woman's voice sharp enough to cut through the restaurant's carefully maintained ambience. Victoria Pemberton, 45 years old, third-generation oil money, sat rigid in her chair, scanning the dining room like a general surveying a battlefield. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a style that cost more than most people's. Monthly salary diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, catching the chandelier light with every gesture. Next to her sat her husband, Marcus, a man who seemed to carry the weight of invisible burdens. His dark suit was tailored perfectly, his posture straight, but his eyes held something that didn't match the luxury around him. He spoke quietly when he spoke at all, and spent most of the evening watching other tables, other conversations, other lives. There was something unsettled about him tonight, like a man searching for something he couldn't quite name. Something just beyond his reach. Victoria had already sent back the bread basket. The water wasn't cold enough. The music was too loud, then too soft. The lighting was wrong. Her complaints came in steady waves, each one delivered with the kind of authority that only comes from never being told no. The other diners had started to notice her voice, carrying across the room, cutting through conversations at nearby tables, creating ripples of discomfort that spread outward like stones dropped in still water. Marcus would quietly apologize to whoever server happened to be nearby, his voice barely above a whisper. Sorry about that. She's had a long day, but his eyes told a different story. This wasn't about a long day. This was about who Victoria was when she thought no one important was watching. He'd learned years ago that apologizing for his wife's behavior was easier than confronting it. But tonight, something felt different tonight. Every harsh word from her mouth seemed to land on him like a physical blow. Across the dining room, Jasmine was taking an order from a family celebrating their daughter's graduation from law school. The young woman was animated, talking about her plans to work in civil rights law, her parents beaming with pride. Jasmine found herself smiling, genuinely smiling, as she wrote down their selections. Moments like these reminded her why she worked so hard, why she pushed through exhaustion, why she believed in something better. This young lawyer would go out and make the world fairer, more just. And maybe someday Jasmine would be doing the same from inside a hospital, saving lives instead of serving dinner. But fairness felt far away when she approached table 12. Victoria's eyes tracked her movement like a predator watching prey. Marcus looked up briefly, his gaze lingering on Jasmine's face. Something flickered there, recognition, maybe, or curiosity. But it passed so quickly Jasmine almost missed it. There was something familiar about his features, something that tugged at the edges of her memory, like a song she'd heard long ago but couldn't quite remember. "Good evening, Jasmine," said her voice professional and warm. "My name is Jasmine. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with something to drink?" Victoria didn't look up from her phone. "We'll have the Dom Perignon. And make sure the glasses are properly chilled. I don't want fingerprints on anything that touches this table." "Yes, ma'am," Jasmine replied. "Anything else I can get started for you?" Victoria finally looked up, her gaze sharp and calculating like she was assessing merchandise at an auction. "Are you new here?" "I don't recognize you. I've been here almost 2 years," Jasmine answered. "Is there something specific you'd like to know about the menu?" Marcus cleared his throat. "We're fine for now. Thank you." His voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but Victoria cut him off. "I wasn't finished speaking," she said, her voice rising just enough to catch the attention of nearby tables. "I asked if you were new because the service here used to have standards." Jasmine felt her cheeks warm, but kept her expression neutral. She trained herself over years of service work to absorb these little cuts, these casual cruelties. Without flinching, "I apologize. If there's been any issue with the service, what can I do to make sure your evening is perfect?" Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying Jasmine like she was examining a piece of art she was considering buying. Perfect would be servers who understand their place and don't interrupt conversations between their betters. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Other diners had definitely heard conversations at nearby tables, had grown quieter, heads turning slightly to catch the exchange the restaurant's refined atmosphere seemed to crack around Victoria's voice like ice under pressure. Difficult customers before, but this felt different, more personal, more dangerous, like Victoria was using her as a target for something much larger, much deeper than dissatisfaction with restaurant service. The other servers had noticed a commotion. Miguel, the head bartender, was watching from behind the mahogany bar. His expression concerned the maitre d', hovered near the kitchen door, ready to intervene if necessary. But they all knew the protocol. When dealing with high-end clientele, you absorbed the abuse, you smiled through humiliation. You protected the restaurant's reputation, even at the cost of your own dignity. "I understand your concerns," Jasmine said. "Carefully, let me get your champagne and give you a few more minutes to look over the menu." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Don't tell me what I need. I'll tell you what I need. What I need is for you people to remember that this isn't some diner where you can slack off and still get paid." "You people," the words echoed in Jasmine's mind like a bell that couldn't be unrung. She'd heard them before in different contexts, different situations, but always with the same meaning, always meant to diminish the separate, to remind her that some people saw her as fundamentally different, fundamentally. Lest the phrase carried centuries of weight, generations of pain, dressed up in polite language that fooled no one. Marcus was looking directly at Jasmine, now his expression troubled, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that kept shifting every time he got close to understanding it. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like pain, as if Victoria's words were hurting him too, as if he was seeing something he'd spent years trying not to see. "I'll get that champagne right away," Jasmine said, her voice still professional, though it took every ounce of her strength to keep it steady as she walked toward the bar. She could feel other servers watching, could sense the sympathy and share frustration in their glances. This wasn't unusual at La Belle Epoque or anywhere else she'd worked, but that didn't make it easier, didn't make it hurt less. Behind the bar, Miguel, the head bartender, had already heard the exchange. "You okay?" he asked quietly as he pulled the champagne from the wine fridge. His accent carried traces of his childhood in El Salvador, and his eyes held the understanding of someone who'd faced his own share of casual cruelty. "I'm fine," Jasmine replied, though they both knew fine was a lie, just another Saturday night in paradise. Miguel shook his head. "That woman's been coming here for years, always the same attitude, always the same disrespect, treats every server like they're beneath her notice. But her husband, there's something different about him, something that doesn't fit. He's not like the usual clientele who wear their privilege like armor. This guy seems almost uncomfortable with it." Jasmine looked back toward table 12. Victoria was gesturing animatedly, her voice carrying across the room. Marcus sat in silence, his gaze focused on something outside the window, or maybe on nothing at all. "What do you mean?" Jasmine asked. Miguel polished 2 champagne flutes slowly, deliberately. "He's been watching you all evening, not in a creepy way, more like he's trying to figure something out, like he knows you from somewhere." Jasmine frowned. "I've never seen him before. Trust me, I'd remember someone like him. This isn't exactly my social circle," maybe Miguel said, "but he remembers something I've seen. That look before recognition, fighted with confusion, like when you see someone from your past, but they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, makes you question your own memory." Jasmine carried the champagne back to table 12, her mind racing. Was it possible she'd met Marcus before, somewhere outside this world of crystal and privilege, but where their lives moved in completely different circles? She was a nursing student working 2 jobs to pay for school. He was clearly part of the wealthy elite who frequented places like this, yet something about his face nagged at her like a half-remembered dream. As she approached the table, she could hear Victoria's voice getting shriller, more demanding. And another thing Victoria was saying, the temperature in here is ridiculous. Do they not understand that people are wearing actual clothing, not uniforms designed for manual labor? Marcus looked up as Jasmine arrived. Their eyes met for just a moment, and something passed between them, a flicker of something that felt almost like sadness mixed with longing. "Your champagne, Jasmine," said, placing the bottle in the ice bucket and pouring 2 glasses with practiced precision. The Dom Perignon was a 2012 vintage worth more than her monthly rent. But she handled it with the same care she'd given Ibato her training, had taught her that respect for the product translated into tips, and tips meant textbooks. Victoria didn't acknowledge her, just continued her tirade about the restaurant, the staff, the declining standards of service everywhere. But Marcus said thank you quietly, almost under his breath, and when their fingers accidentally brushed as he reached for his glass, Jasmine felt that same strange recognition. Miguel had mentioned there was something about the way he moved, the shape of his hands, the curve of his smile. When he looked at her, that stirred memories she couldn't quite access. "Have you decided on appetizers?" she asked, trying to focus on the job, on a routine, on anything except the way Marcus kept looking at her like he was seeing a ghost. Victoria finally turned her attention to the menu. "This is ridiculous," she announced. $28 for what's essentially fancy lettuce highway robbery. The entitlement in her voice was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "It's actually arugula with pear and goat cheese." Jasmine explained the pears are poached in white wine, and the goat cheese is made locally at Meadowbrook Farm. It's become one of our most popular starters. Did I ask for a lecture? Victoria snapped. "I can read. What I want to know is why this restaurant thinks it can charge premium prices for mediocre ingredients prepared by people who probably learned to cook watching YouTube videos." The insult was so casual, so effortless, that it took Jasmine's breath away. This wasn't just about the food or the service. This was about something much deeper, much more systemic. Victoria's worldview didn't just exclude people like Jasmine, it actively diminished them, reducing their skills, their education, their worth to stereotypes and assumptions. Marcus set down his champagne glass a little too hard to sound sharp against the crystal, like a warning shot. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying a warning that made nearby diners turn their heads. "No, it's not enough," she replied, turning her venom toward him. "You always do this. You always take their side instead of supporting your wife." "I'm not taking anyone's side," he said quietly, but his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "I'm asking you to treat people with respect." "Respect," Victoria laughed to sound brittle and cold, like glass breaking. "Respect is earned, not given away to every person with their hand out expecting something they haven't worked for." The words hit Jasmine like a slap across the face, the implication that she hadn't worked for her position, that she was somehow asking for handouts when she'd been working since she was 14 years old, cleaning houses, with her grandmother saving every penny for college, studying while her friends partied, working double shifts while pursuing her nursing degree. Jasmine stood perfectly still, professionally invisible, while the couple's marriage played out in front of her and anyone else within hearing distance. This wasn't about the menu or the service or the temperature. This was about something deeper, something that had been building between them for much longer than this evening. The other diners weren't even pretending not to listen anymore. Marcus was looking at her again, that same puzzled expression, like he was trying to remember something important, something just out of reach. There was intensity to his gaze that made Jasmine uncomfortable, not because it felt inappropriate, but because it felt too familiar, too knowing, as if he could see past her server's uniform to the person underneath. The moment stretched thick with tension and unspoken histories until Victoria's voice cut through it like a blade. "Well," she set her attention back on Jasmine, "are you going to stand there gawking all night? Or are you going to take our order? Some of us have places to be, people to see, lives that matter." The words hit Jasmine like a physical blow. Lives that matter, the implication clear, stark, devastating in its casual cruelty, that her life, her dreams, her struggles didn't matter, that she was nothing more than a servant whose only purpose was to make Victoria's evening more comfortable. The restaurant around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But before she could respond, before she could find words to defend herself or simply walk away, Marcus spoke. His voice was different now, stronger, clearer, filled with something that hadn't been there before. "Victoria," he said, looking directly at his wife, but speaking loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "that is completely unacceptable." "Unacceptable," Victoria repeated, her eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "What's unacceptable is paying these prices for this level of service." The condescension in her voice could a frozen wine know. Marcus said standing up slowly as movements, deliberate, controlled. What's unacceptable is the way you're treating another human being. The restaurant had grown quieter, conversation stopping mid-sentence as other diners tuned into drama unfolding at table 12. The elegant atmosphere that management worked so hard to maintain was crackling with tension. Servers paused in their duties. The maitre d' stepped closer, ready to intervene, but uncertain how to handle a situation involving one of their most prominent patrons. Victoria's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger. It was impossible to tell Marcus, "Sit down, you're making a scene." "I'm not making anything," he replied, his voice steady. "You are, and it needs to stop." The authority in his voice was something Jasmine had never heard from him before, as if he was finally stepping into some version of himself that had been waiting in the wings. Jasmine found herself frozen, caught between walking away and staying to see how this played out. She'd witnessed arguments before between couples, between customers and staff, but this felt different, more personal, more consequential, as if something fundamental was shifting in the air around them. Victoria stood up as well, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the suddenly quiet restaurant. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with rage. "If you want to embarrass me in front of all these people, go right ahead. But don't expect me to stand here and be lectured about how to treat the help." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the entire dining room. Other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away, others leaning forward to hear better. The elegant veneer of the restaurant couldn't hide the ugly truth that was being exposed at table 12. Marcus's face changed. Something shifted behind his eyes, recognition finally breaking through like sunlight through clouds. He looked at Jasmine, really looked at her for the first time all evening, and she saw the exact moment when he figured out, when the pieces fell into place, when 26 years of wondering and searching and hoping suddenly made sense. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the restaurant, every word carried clear and unmistakable. "Jasmine," he said, and hearing her name in his voice made her breath catch. There was something in the way he said it that spoke of familiarity, of affection, of a history she couldn't remember but felt in her bones. Victoria looked between them, confusion replacing anger on her perfectly made-up face. "How do you know her name?" she demanded, her voice shrill with disbelief. Marcus didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was too big, too complicated, too beautiful and terrible to explain in a few simple sentences. Instead, he took a step forward toward Jasmine, his eyes never leaving her face, searching for confirmation of what he already knew. "Little J," he whispered, and those two words unlocked a door in Jasmine's memory that had been sealed for decades. "Is that really you?" Jasmine's professional composure finally cracked, tears spilling over before she could stop them, because there was only one person in the world who had ever called her, that only one person who could make those words sound like coming home. Marcus, she breathed, and 26 years of separation, of different worlds, of parallel lives that should have intersected, but somehow never did, collapsed into nothing. Victoria watched this exchange, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying to understand what was happening to her perfectly ordered evening, to her perfectly controlled husband, to her perfectly predictable world. "What is this?" she demanded. "What's going on here? How do you two know each other?" Marcus turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Victoria saw something in his eyes that wasn't gentle, wasn't apologetic, wasn't trying to keep peace at any cost. There was steel there now, strength that she'd never seen before. "This," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "This is my sister." The silence that followed Marcus's declaration stretched across La Belle Epoque like a held breath. Every conversation had stopped, every fork had been lowered to plates, every wine glass sat forgotten on white tablecloths as the weight of those three words settled over the dining room. "This is my sister." Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear, as the implications of what her husband had just said began to sink in. Sister Victoria repeated the word like it was foreign on her tongue, like it couldn't possibly mean what she thought it meant. "That impossible, Marcus. You don't have a sister. You have told me you would have." Marcus looked at his wife with an expression that seemed to contain decades of disappointment. "I had a sister," he said quietly. "I've always had a sister. I just didn't know where she was." Jasmine stood frozen between the two of them, her servers training, warring, with the emotional tsunami crashing over her. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be Marcus, the little boy she'd shared a bedroom in the group home before he was adopted by a wealthy family and disappeared from her life. Forever the little boy who used to braid her hair and tell her stories about the family they'd have someday when they were old enough to take care of themselves. Can you imagine the shock in that room when family bonds trump prejudice if this story is giving you chills? Smash that like button. And let us know in the comments, have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's true character was revealed? Keep watching, because this revelation was just the beginning. Marcus took another step toward Jasmine, his eyes searching her face for the little girl he'd known 26 years ago. You were 7. He said, his voice thick with emotion. When they separated us, Mrs. Patterson said you'd been placed with a good family. Said you'd be better off. I tried to find you when I turned 18, but the records were sealed. I've been looking for you ever since. Jasmine's hand went to her throat, where a small scar, barely visible, now marked where she'd fallen from their shared bunk bed the night before Marcus was taken away. You caught me, she whispered, the memory flooding back with startling clarity. When I fell, you caught me, and you said we'd always be family no matter what happened to us. Victoria's voice cut to the moment like a knife. This is ridiculous. She said, her tone shrill with desperation. Marcus, you're being manipulated. Can't you see that this girl is obviously trying to take advantage of you? She probably overheard something about your past, and now she's pretending to be your sister to get money or attention or whatever it is people like her want. People like her, Marcus repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. What exactly do you mean by people like her? Victoria looked around the restaurant, suddenly aware that every eye was on her. Every phone was potentially recording every word she said, was being absorbed by an audience she couldn't control. She began and stopped as she realized there was no way to finish that sentence without revealing exactly who she was. The other diners weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing something larger than a family reunion. They were seeing the ugly underbelly of privilege exposed, watching a woman who'd spent her life treating service workers like subhumans discover that one of them was family to the man she'd married, a man whose money and status she'd built her identity around. Jasmine looked at Victoria with something that might have been pity. You call me filthy. She said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. You said my life didn't matter. You spent the last hour treating me like I was less than human. And now you're finding out that I'm family to the man you love. How does that feel, Victoria? Victoria's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Because what could she say? How could she explain 20 years of marriage built on the assumption that her husband shared her values, her prejudices, her casual cruelty toward anyone she deemed beneath her notice? How could she reconcile a man she thought she knew was someone who could love and claim a black sister? Marcus reached out tentatively and touched Jasmine's hand, the gesture simple but profound. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry for what she said to you, for how she treated you. I should have stopped at the moment it started. I should have recognized you. I should have. Jasmine squeezed his hand, cutting off his words. We were children when they separated us. She said you couldn't have known. But the guilt in Marcus's eyes went deeper than just tonight's events. This was the weight of 26 years of privilege, of moving through the world in a way his sister never could have married, to a woman whose cruelty he'd excused and enabled because it was easier than confronting the truth about who she really was. I've been complicit. He said the words, barely audible. I've been part of the problem. Victoria tried to regain control of the situation. Marcus, she said, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she used when she wanted something. Let's discuss this at home, privately, away from all these people. Marcus turned to look at her, and for the first time Victoria saw her husband clearly. The man she thought was weak was actually strong. The man she'd assumed shared her values was disgusted by them. The man she'd taken for granted was done. No, he said simply, we're done discussing things privately. Your mask is off, Victoria. Everyone can see who you really are. And I can't pretend anymore that I don't see it too. Victoria's face went white with rage. How dare you, she hissed. How dare you embarrass me like this in public for some stranger, some waitress, who's probably lying about everything. Jasmine felt the familiar sting of those words, but this time she wasn't alone. This time someone was standing with her. Someone was choosing her over comfort, over convenience, over the easy lie that let people like Victoria sleep at night. I'm not a stranger, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm his sister. And I've been working 2 jobs to put myself through nursing school. I volunteer at a pediatric clinic. I'm not asking for anything from you or from him except basic human decency. The word decency hung in the air like an indictment. Victoria had built her entire identity around being better than other people. But here was a woman who actually was better, who worked harder, who contributed more, who treated others with the respect that Victoria had never learned to give. The contrast was so stark, it was almost blinding. Other diners had begun to move closer, drawn by the drama, but also by something deeper, the recognition that they were witnessing a moment of truth that rarely played out so publicly. The servers had stopped pretending to work and were openly watching. Miguel, the bartender, had his phone out not to record, but to call security if things escalated. The maitre d' was calculating how much damage control would be needed, but also feeling something like justice in the air. Marcus looked around the restaurant at all the faces watching them and made a decision that would change everything I want everyone here to know. He said, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room, that this woman, Jasmine Williams, is my sister. She was separated from me when we were children, and I spent my adult life looking for her. She's a nursing student. She volunteers at a children's clinic, and she's one of the strongest people I've ever known. He turned to Victoria. My wife called her filthy, suggested her life didn't matter, treated her with cruelty that I should never have tolerated from anyone, let alone someone I married. I want to apologize publicly for my complicity, for my silence, for allowing this behavior to continue unchecked. The restaurant erupted in applause, spontaneous and heartfelt, as strangers found themselves moved by a display of integrity they rarely witnessed. Victoria looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route or an ally, but found neither. The other wealthy patrons she expected to support her were either applauding Marcus or looking at her with undisguised disgust. Her social circle, her carefully cultivated image, her entire identity was crumbling in real time. You're all insane, she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. This is completely ridiculous. I will not be humiliated by the help. The word helped spark something in the crowd, a murmured disapproval that grew louder. Several diners stood up when an elderly black woman who'd been dining with her grandson walked over to Jasmine. Honey, she said, I heard every word, and I want you to know that woman doesn't speak for all of us. Some of us know class when we see it, and it's not about money. Other patrons began approaching, offering support words of encouragement, business cards from people who'd been impressed by Jasmine's composure. Under pressure, a federal judge handed her his card and said, if you ever need a character reference for anything, I was here tonight. I saw how you conducted yourself as CEO of a nonprofit that funded nursing scholarships, wrote her contact information on a napkin. Victoria watched this outpouring of support with growing horror, realizing that her attempt to humiliate Jasmine had backfired spectacularly. Instead of exposing the waitress as someone beneath notice, she revealed herself as someone beneath contempt. Marcus, this has to stop, she said desperately. You're destroying our marriage, our reputation, everything we've built together. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been sadness. We didn't build anything together, Victoria. I compromised who I was to avoid conflict, while you build a fortress of cruelty and entitlement. I should have stopped this years ago. I should have seen that staying silent made me complicit in every cruel thing you said to every person you consider beneath you. The manager of La Belle Époque, a distinguished man in his 50s, approached the table with careful steps. He'd been watching from the kitchen, trying to decide how to handle a situation involving one of their most prominent patrons, Mrs. Pemberton. He said politely, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Victoria whirled on him. You can't be serious. She said, I've been dining here for 15 years. I bring important people here. This restaurant owes its reputation to people like me. The manager's expression didn't change, ma'am, after what I witnessed tonight. I can assure you this restaurant's reputation will be just fine. Without your patronage, please gather your things. Several other diners burst into applause at this, and someone called out, good for you, from across the room. Victoria looked around desperately, but found no support even among her own social class. She grabbed her purse from the table, her hands shaking with rage. This isn't over, she said to Marcus. You'll regret this when you realize what you've thrown away, when you come to your senses. And remember who you really are. Marcus looked at her with finality. I know exactly who I am, he said. And for the first time in 20 years, I'm not ashamed of it. Victoria stormed toward the exit, but couldn't resist one final shot. She turned back to face the dining room. Enjoying your little show, she called out, but don't think this changes anything. People like her will always be people like her, and people like me will always be people like me. The restaurant fell silent again, but this time the silence was different, charged with indignation. Marcus looked at his sister with love and something like, you know what the difference is between people like you and people like her, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the restaurant. People like her work for what they have. People like her treat others with dignity. People like her make the world better just by being in it. And people like you, Victoria, people like you just take up space. Victoria's face contorted with fury, and she opened her mouth to say something else, but the applause that erupted drowned out whatever venom she planned to spill. She stood there for a moment, looking smaller, somehow diminished by her own hatred, before finally stalking out of the restaurant, the heavy door closing behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. In the aftermath, Marcus and Jasmine sat together at a quiet table away from the other diners, talking about the years between then And now about the paths that had led them to this moment. Jasmine told him about growing up in foster care, about working her way through college, about her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse. Marcus told her about the guilt he'd carried about the comfortable life he'd built while not knowing if she was safe or struggling about the growing awareness that his privilege came at a cost he'd never fully understood. "I kept your picture," he said, pulling out his wallet and showing her a faded photograph of two children hugging outside a group home. "I've carried it everywhere, hoping someday I'd find you." Jasmine laughed through her tears. "That's why you look familiar." She said, "I couldn't place it, but something about your face reminded me of home, of feeling safe." The other diners gradually returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the way people looked at each other, in the acknowledgement that every person serving them, cleaning up after them, making their evening possible, had their own story, their own dreams, their own worth that existed completely independent of their service. Miguel brought over 2 glasses of champagne on the house. He said, his eyes bright with unshed tears, for the reunion and for standing up for what's right. Other servers stopped by their table throughout the evening, sharing their own stories of difficult customers, of moments when they'd been treated as less than human, of times when someone had stood up for them, or times when no one had. As the evening wound down, Marcus looked at his sister seriously. "I want to help with your education," he said. "I know you've been working so hard, and I have resources I should have been sharing with you all along." Jasmine shook her head. "I don't need charity, Marcus. I need family. I need someone who sees me, who knows where I came from, who remembers that we promised to always be family no matter what." Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all evening. "Then that's what you'll have," he said. "Always. I want to know about your life, your friends, your dreams, everything I missed. I want to be part of your world, not because I feel guilty, but because you're my sister, and I love you." Jasmine felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been tight and guarded for 26 years. The evening had started with a traffic stop of humiliation and cruelty, but it had transformed into something else entirely, a recognition that family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about choosing to stand with someone when it matters, choosing love over comfort, choosing truth over convenience, choosing to see people as they really are rather than as you assume them to be.